ultimately these are devices we put in to help students learn in lessons, right? So anything that disrupts the flow of a lesson is not a good place to be, is it?
It always staggers me that you're talking about 35,000 devices that you're actually talking that you've rolled out.
We're used to technology being in our homes, and I think the great thing about Apple technology in particular, it's consumer simple. That's the thing. We want to bring that consumer simple nature and innovations that Apple have into the classroom. But of course, when we scale it up to 35,000 devices, there's a lot that needs to go into the planning and to make sure that it is consumer simple when it comes into that kind of scale.
Hi, and welcome to this episode of the Empowered podcast. This series is looking at the impact of EdTech within and outside of classrooms. My name's Ricky Brown, and I'm an Apple Professional Learning Specialist at Sync. Today I'm going to be talking to Simon Cleverley from Oasis Community Learning and Craig Smith from Jamf to talk about what is required technically to support a digital strategy. So first of all, welcome Craig and welcome Simon. Let's start this off with asking, what does technical excellence mean to you? And I'll start with you, Craig.
Thanks, Ricky. Great question. I think for me, it's when the technology is almost invisible. It's because it's been seamlessly integrated that a staff member, a student can pick up a piece of technology and just use it like it was pen and paper almost. But we know a lot has to go into the planning and the organisation behind that to make that possible. And I think when that happens, they almost become, the teacher or the pupil becomes kind of unconsciously competent with technology. So it's just another tool in their toolbox. And I think for IT as well, so the IT side of the fence, they stop being someone that's the firefighter that's trying to solve issues all the time and actually start to really be able to innovate. And I'm sure, Simon will touch on that today and some of the really interesting things that they're doing at OCL. But yeah, that for me is the key thing. It's almost being invisible, but allowing IT to really innovate and provide the staff or the students with great experiences.
I think that's nice about being invisible. If we can get it to be just something that works for them and they feel comfortable and competent in using it, then we can actually move that on a little bit further with the practice within classrooms.
100%.
What about you, Sam?
I think Craig's absolutely right. My role is head of national infrastructure at Oasis, and I roll out technology to 35,000 users, and that technology's got to work straight off. We have to make sure that it's all tested, fit for purpose, and that as Craig said, that somebody can just pick up that technology, whether it's an iPad or a computer or no matter what it is, and be able to use it without even thinking, basically. If something doesn't work right from the off, then people lose faith in it and lose confidence in that technology, and it won't be successful.
Absolutely, and it always staggers me that you're talking about 35,000 devices that you're actually talking that you've rolled out. Obviously, that's a big job, and again, we've talked about there's a lot to go in the back end of this. What sort of things would you put in the back end of this? What sort of things should we be thinking about when we're actually doing this technical excellence in schools? So again, I'll go back to you, Simon.
So it's making sure that you've got the infrastructure in place to support it. When you're rolling devices out at scale, 35,000 devices, you need to make sure you've got a wireless infrastructure that can support it. You have the bandwidth available to handle all the traffic. You've got the systems and services in place that can handle all of that data. And actually, you've got tools available for people to use no matter where they are in the world. So things like SharePoint and OneDrive that people can save all their resources to, so that students particularly can be educated at home if needs be, as we found out during the pandemic, along with communication tools like Teams and that sort of thing.
So there's quite a lot in there, and I'm sure we'll unpick it through this. And you mentioned the word pandemic, and I know when the pandemic came around, technology was something that people went, actually, we need to use this technology.
Definitely, and I think it's moved the dial forward significantly because people were almost forced into having to use it. But I think now the genie's out the bottle with tech, and it's been a really, if one good thing comes out of pandemic, it is that it's moved a lot of people's thinking forward in terms of having to use technology, but actually seeing the benefits of using it. And to touch on something that Simon mentioned earlier with regards to it has to work, I think people are, we're less sort of sympathetic when it doesn't. We're used to technology being in our homes, and I think the great thing about Apple technology in particular, it's consumer simple. That's the thing. We want to bring that consumer simple nature and innovations that Apple have into the classroom. But of course, when we scale it up to 35,000 devices, there's a lot that needs to go into the planning and to make sure that it is consumer simple when it comes into that kind of scale.
And I think you're right about being consumer simple. It's one of those things. These devices were actually made for consumers in the very first place, and that makes it a little bit more harder to actually maybe lock these devices down or do what you want to do it so that it can have what you need in the device in itself. If I can just, I think I'll come back to that one, but I just want to go on this pandemic bit because we've talked about it's made that difference. But Simon, you did this. You were rolling this out before the pandemic.
We started on the journey before the pandemic, and we had pilot sites running before the pandemic. And Craig and I were talking for a long time actually before the main rollout. And then the pandemic hit, and we had to accelerate that program. But we accelerated the program at the same time that everybody else did. So, that logistically came with some challenges in getting hardware, getting cases. All the bits and pieces at the same time everybody else was. So that was a challenge at the time.
So having getting all the devices and everything else. I mean, can you just remind us how many sites do you work over? There's 35,000 devices, but how many sites is it?
Yeah, so we have 54 academies in the group now. Spread over the whole of England, really, right across the length and breadth of England.
So it's not just like a small local area.
It's geographically challenging in some aspects when you're rolling out a program like this.
And I suppose also with doing that, you've got the aspect of every place is different. Every demographic in every place is different as well, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, that's right. I mean, we're fortunate. We've got a really good IT team that's spread out across all of those sites. So we do have boots on the ground, if you will. So it makes deploying things at scale much easier in that aspect. And we've got a really good relationship with all the academies as an IT department, which is really important. I mean, we found out during the Horizons program that actually relationships, not just with partners like Jamf or Apple or anybody else we work with, but actually relationships internally to deploy a project at scale is really, really important.
I agree with you. Communication is massive. Let's go back to that point of these devices are consumer devices. What can you do with these devices? And managing them over 52 sites, 35,000 devices is a real headache if you have to go to each site and do everything manually on these devices. Is there a simple way of doing something?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when I first got into Apple technology, sort of back late sort of 2000s, 2009, 2010, around about that time when iPad first came out, mobile device management didn't exist back then. So people were literally plugging devices into a computer, a Mac, and manually provisioning them. And thankfully we don't have to do that anymore, because I think that would have been impossible for something like OCL's Horizons project. But obviously with MDM, with Jamf, we can provision stuff over the air. Devices can be shipped, as I'm sure you guys did during pandemic. Shrink wrapped in the box. User can take that device out the cellophane wrap and have that amazing Apple experience of unboxing it and all. That user experience that Apple are legendary for, we want to give that experience to children who might not have the opportunity to use that type of technology. And I know that Simon and the team at OCL, that was a big part of what they did during that initial rollout. And with Jamf, we can help make that happen. And in many cases can enhance that experience. So making sure that all the apps and everything they need is already on the device straight out of the box. but also keep them safe and secure with different settings and security profiles.
It was really important to us actually. It was a fundamental part of the project that we wanted the devices or the students to feel like the device was their own and to take the wrapper off and to turn it on for the very first time. We work in some of the most challenging parts of the country and the most deprived areas of the country. And so, we know that some families' internet access was sometimes off just a single mobile phone. And we really wanted to change that. So the Horizons programme was designed not only for student use in education, but also to allow access to things like government websites or health services or banking for the family when the device is at home. And that was really important to us that was the case.
So the device became more of a family device at certain times, but surely that would mean that you've got, well, you said banking apps, and you've got banking apps on the device, and you've got, say, Netflix on the device, or certain things like that. Surely that caused a headache. Is that how could that be managed?
So we use Apple IDs or education Apple IDs as part of our Apple School Manager tenant, and by default that doesn't allow access to the Apple App Store. The Apple App Store is blocked if you're signed into a device. So we utilise Jamf self-service, which is a curated app store almost. So we purchase apps in bulk, whether it's buying at a cost or whether they're free from the Apple School Manager tenant. And we make them available to sets of users. So there may be some apps that we've deployed in self-service that are only available to staff, some that are just tailored to primary users, and some for secondary users, or all. So we deploy these apps to self-service, and then the student can open up the self-service app and download Netflix if they want to. As Craig said, at the device deployment level, we mandate that some of our productivity suite is deployed. So we use Microsoft as our productivity tool set. All of those apps are downloaded automatically alongside some of our filtering tools. But everything else is available in self-service to users to download and remove whenever they like.
There's a couple of ways we can help with that. So we can have what we call time-based restrictions as well. So you can restrict apps at certain times of the day. We can also restrict basically the network traffic from specific apps as well. So you can actually say, we don't want this app to get access to the internet. So you might be able to launch Netflix, but you're not going to be able to actually use it. So there is different ways we can do that. And I think it is really great to see what OCL have done with regards to opening it up, because I think there is a tendency, just because you can restrict stuff that you do, especially maybe historically IT would have that sort of be a bit more heavy-handed and let's just lock everything down. But obviously we don't want to do that too much, because then the device arguably doesn't become as useful. So I think it's fantastic to see that they have opened it up to allow access to a lot of essential services, like you mentioned, Simon, but also understanding that they want staff and students to make a connection with that device. They want to love using the device, and part of that is just being able to, do your internet shopping and watch some entertainment apps and stuff like that. So I think it is an important part of any sort of how would I put it, that sort of transformation program where you're trying to bring people on board who might not actually want to use the device in the first place.
I think you are right. I think it's that bit of ownership.
Yeah.
It's that bit of ownership and being able to do something with the device and have that feeling of, well, what's in it for me? What can I do? What's this going to benefit me for? And I'm just thinking about that ownership and something you said about children opening devices, and you saying it was really important. What did that feel like for yourself, watching some of these children? You've said from deprived areas, and what did it feel like to you of watching these children open these devices? We said about the Apple, the anticipation, and the time that the box drops and all of that sort of thing. What was that like, Simon?
I remember going to one of our academies actually on their launch day. It was one of the first pilot sites to go over, and I remember thinking that I worked on hundreds of projects for Oasis in my career with them, and a lot of those projects are kind of indirect impact on students. So it could be changing an MIS system, for example, and that has an indirect impact on students because we can maybe surface the data in a different way or see analysis and trends in a different way. But the Horizons program was one of the first projects I've worked on that has a direct impact on students' education and bridging that kind of digital divide, really. And I remember seeing the look on students' faces when they were taking the wrapper off the box and lifting his iPad out that they may have never done before. And I found kind of really emotional, actually. It was just a real great achievement for that Oasis have done here. So yeah, it was kind of a once in a lifetime project that really changes the outcomes of students.
I mean, again, I was privileged to be at one of your schools when they were opening devices, and you never get the same feeling when that device opens up and you see their own name on it, and then suddenly you think, oh my goodness, well, this is mine. Yeah. And you haven't touched it or anything. Do you know what I mean? It's that sort of thing that really opens that door to them.
There's a story actually of one of our students in the Midlands that he was an elective mute, and nobody had ever heard him speak, and he went off with his iPad and recorded himself speaking and took it back into the classroom and played it, and it was the first time anybody had heard him speak, and that was just a fabulous thing to see, an impact straight away.
Absolutely, and again, that's what we want as teachers in classrooms. We want to be able to do that difference. So Simon, if we can go back on one of the things that probably still gives you nightmares, if I'm being honest, when you got that phone call and they turned around to you and said, can you run this one-to-one device program? I mean, 35,000 devices, 52 schools, 53 schools. What was the first things that were going through your head?
I kind of joke even to this day, actually. I kind of joke about how hard could it be, but it's actually really, really difficult to pull off. But I remember thinking what a kind of game-changing project this would be. I mean, we were talking, as we said earlier on, that this was being rolled out before the pandemic. So we decided to give every student a device to enable them to learn wherever they were and to enable that education in the classroom. And I remember thinking that this is going to be a fabulous project to work on. But obviously that comes with its challenges to make sure that all of our infrastructure is right, and training and all of the things we spoke about earlier on were in place even before we could think about deploying it, really.
So when you talk about these things that you do in the background, obviously this doesn't just happen overnight, does it? I mean, it's something that you'll have obviously been planning for a while. And what was the first thing that you started to think about when you thought about, right, we're going to do a one-to-one?
It's really tricky. So the first thing is you need to make sure that actually everybody is aware of what you're trying to do and what people's involvement in the project is. So from my team, that was making sure that we had network engineers, making sure the network was prepped and ready so that we had full Wi-Fi coverage. So for example, we surveyed every single academy, did heat maps and throughput tests on the Wi-Fi. We bought hundreds of new access points to make sure that we plugged gaps where there were gaps, and we increased all of our bandwidth on our internet connections to make sure we had enough bandwidth to cope with the additional traffic. And then the systems team putting in things like caching servers everywhere to make sure that actually, when an app's deployed or requested, it will be cached on the caching server, so then all the other devices will pick it up locally rather than through the internet. So there were some infrastructure bits and pieces we had to do, but it was also building relationships with people like Craig, Sync, other providers that were supplying us cases, and building those relationships. And then there was the projects team that were liaising with each academy to pilot it initially, to then, once the pilot was successful, and it wasn't a pilot to decide whether the device was right for us or not, it was a pilot to make sure that all our processes and procedures was right, and that the logistics were there, the devices would arrive on time, the cases would arrive on time to support the rollout. And then once that was all done, is to then work out the project plan. So that was working with the academies then to decide the rollout plan, taking into consideration Ofsted visits to make sure that we weren't going to deploy on an Ofsted visit. So there are many, many different people involved, both internally and externally, to pull this off.
I mean, I will come to you in a second, Craig. I'm just intrigued about, you've mentioned about the broadband that's coming in, the pipes that are coming in, and the access points that are in classrooms and so on. Is there anything that's available at the moment that schools should be thinking about to actually help with that sort of setup?
But you can't test at scale. And whilst you can survey the Wi-Fi now, so you can use tools to do heat mapping and throughput testing and walking around the academies with some wireless survey tools, we still found after deployment there were still some gaps somewhere. There may have been some more communal areas like halls and atriums and those high density areas that we had to put in higher density access points after the rollout, because you know it's not something you could have picked up during the testing. So there were some gotchas, but you know the advice is really, isn't it, is test as much as you can, test the deployment small scale, make sure that the setup is how you want it. I said we really wanted the device to be the student to feel that the device was their own, but for me, I needed to know who had that device so that we could target filtering correctly, or you know, just from asset management, so we knew exactly who had it. So you know, as soon as they took the wrapper off and turned it on, they're prompted with a login screen, enter your username and password. So they could single sign on in, which registered that device in Jamf then against the user, and then all the policies and all the profiles then deploy because the Jamf knows who they are.
Is there any sort of funding or any sort of schemes that schools should be looking at now to what's possible to make sure, because we've talked about technologies now really something that all schools should be taking in place with where they're going and what they're doing. The pandemic's opened up them doors. Is there something that is out there for a scheme for them to actually look at?
There are programs like Connect the Classroom, so it's a DFE funded program that can help schools and academies upgrade parts of their infrastructure if they're not fit for purpose. There are metrics and eligibility criteria from the DFE to see whether to decide whether you are eligible or not. But typically, you know, if you're not Wi-Fi 6 enabled or you don't have MGig switching or things like that, you could potentially be eligible for funding from the DFE.
MDM, or mobile device management, we tend to use acronyms a lot, don't we, when we talk about technologies, just so everyone's on the same page. So essentially it's a framework from Apple that they provide to vendors like ourselves. Not all MDMs are created equal, I will say that. And obviously Jamf, we only focus on the Apple platform, so that's our sort of unique capabilities. Everything that we do goes into that. So like you say, we can do things over the air, which is great. We can enroll that device, like Simon mentioned. We can push down policy on that device. And also Simon mentioned, perhaps based on what user is authenticated. So is it someone in a primary school? Do they need different settings, different apps? Is it someone in a secondary school? Or maybe it's a staff member that gets different restrictions, or maybe less restrictions than a pupil would. And then obviously is your point on the asset management. So we collect a lot of inventory information, so you can have a complete overview of your estate of not just iPads, and we know that at OCL they use Apple TVs in every classroom, Macs as well, several hundred Macs across the trust also. But then, so what can we do with that data? And I'll let Simon go into more detail, but they've done some really interesting work taking that data and making it something useful in terms of how certain academies might have more challenges with perhaps breakages than others, and maybe why is that, and they can investigate. Perhaps some academies need more professional learning because staff maybe aren't using the devices as much. So they've done some really cool, Simon, they've done some really cool stuff.
Yeah, I was really concerned about the management of 35,000 devices. It's a huge investment financially. It's a huge pool of assets, if you like. And as a national IT team, you know, I'm quite removed from actually what's going on in. I can't be in 54 academies seeing what's going on each day. So I wanted to get a picture of actually what was happening with these devices. You know, are they talking to the network regularly? You know, are they not? And if not, why not? So using the Jamf API and some kind of user-defined fields within Jamf, we are sucking out the data via the API and displaying it within Power BI. So we have some reports that show each academy and devices that haven't spoken to any network anywhere for a certain number of days. So we have like 7, 14, 21 and 42 days, and it's quite I've got some guys that made all this happen, but the fields in Jamf will populate the Power BI dashboard depending on when they last talked to a network somewhere, to give us a picture of, these devices aren't active, and then we can go to the academy teams then say, right, we're not seeing these devices, what's happening with them, where are they?
Yeah, and I think that's really helpful. Like you said, with 35,000 devices, you can't be on track with every single one at one time, but using Power BI behind it will give you that little bit more data. And as you said, it then data influences what you do in the future with that data in itself, isn't it?
We also report on things like iOS versions, so we're quite, cybersecurity is important to us as an organisation, as it is with everybody these days that works in IT. So we really like our devices to be kept up to date all the time. So we've got to pick out the iOS version from Jamf and put that into Power BI so we can see across the estate who hasn't updated, and we can target specific locations for people that haven't updated and need to. Also things like hardware type, so we know that we've got hardware that's supported by Apple still, alongside things like lost and stolen. So we've got a picture of which device is lost and stolen, and again, like Craig said, we can always pick a trend then on, do academies have more damage, or do academies have more lost devices than others, and have those conversations that need to happen.
I'm quite interested in that lost and stolen, because obviously 35,000 devices, if these are all going home, and then surely you're going to have so many of these that are going to be lost or sold in certain places. What can be done about that, Craig?
Well, as Simon says, they can obviously remotely put it into lost mode if they think that it might have been compromised, the device, someone's sold it on or something like that. But I would say it rarely happens, in my experience, working with schools, trusts, local authorities for, well, probably longer than I would care to admit, to be honest. It is a legitimate concern, and it is something that, the people rolling out these projects do worry about. But I'm going to bring Simon in on this as well, but I don't think it happens as much as people think. But having that ability to remotely secure that device, but also because the device is supervised, digitally supervised, when it's enrolled, that MDM profile is not removable. So even if that device was reset and sold down the pub to someone, you hear all these kind of stories. If you go to set that device up, it would come up and say this device belongs to whatever academy. If lost or stolen, please return here. Or it would try and enroll back into Jamf. So it almost becomes like a bit of a paperweight if someone does try to do something nefarious and sell it on or whatever it happens to be. So and quite quickly, people have cottoned on to this, so they don't actually bother now.
I think what you're saying here is communication, that these things can happen. Absolutely. Actually, no matter what happens, we've got to be safeguarding students in schools and outside. And one of the recent updated government reports was they're keeping children safe in education. So I just want to ask you, what processes and steps can a school or a trust put in place that meet some of them recommendations? And I'll start with you, Simon.
So safeguarding is fundamental to everything we do, isn't it? I mean, that goes without saying, that we have to make sure that our students are safe, not only at home and walking to and from school, but also in the digital world as well. We filter students on premise, and whilst we really wanted the devices to be used for home use, we do filter them off-site as well, using various different tools that kind of report back into us about what's been going on. So there is a fine balance when at home, that we do want them to be used as their own device and to be able to watch things like Netflix and play some games or whatever it is they want to do. YouTube typically, I think, is the main thing that students want to do on an iPad these days. But yeah, we have to keep safeguarding it front and centre of everything we do.
What's the difference between the two?
Well, filtering prevents them accessing things they shouldn't do. So we all know that things like prevent, for example, to stop them getting onto various different sites, gambling, for example. Some of those categories of sites. So we block those from being accessed. But also we use a tool for when they're at home that does high level blocking.
So where you're saying if they were searching on something, you already know which device it's coming from, so you actually can pinpoint the person against what they're searching for, And again, if there's a safeguarding thing against that, you can then deal with that. If that
Yeah, exactly. Identity is everything for us. So it doesn't matter whether the student is on, or a staff member indeed. It doesn't matter if they're on an iPad or a laptop or any other kind of managed device. We log what they're doing, basically.
That's good. And anything more you want to add from that, Craig?
Yeah, I mean, this is an area that Jamf has recently came into on filtering and internet security specifically. And the reason for that was, there's a number of reasons, but the main one was we would be working on large projects, and quite often we would run into, or those particular customers would run into a lot of issues with filtering, and we felt that there wasn't really a perfect solution out there. There was some good solutions out there, but they came with different challenges, and I won't obviously name any specific organisations, but things like having to use a proprietary browser, not being able to use the native Safari browser, or constantly having to put in username and password or proxy details. So we felt that there was an opportunity to provide a better solution while being able to provide people like OCL with all the tools that they need to comply with recommendations. And that is about, first and foremost, that prevent, as Simon mentioned, keeping children safe and blocking, content, unsavoury content or unsuitable content. But then obviously the next step in that process, as you rightly mentioned, Ricky, is around the keeping children safe on the internet report, and being able to report on unusual behaviour and specific cases where digital safeguarding leads or safeguarding leads need to be able to make an intervention with that specific child. And that's, for us, will be the next sort of step in our journey with filtering. So our belief is it's protection over inspection, but we also understand that you need to be able to make interventions, and as Simon says, be able to identify device, and where possible, obviously, which student is using that device, so we can prevent. What we want to do is not overwhelm staff more by having lots of data to sift through, so try and filter that in such a way that it becomes something of useful, so that the stuff that they really need to make interventions come to the top quickly and they're made aware of those. But we've looked at what's out there. We've spoken with a lot of customers that we work with, organisations, to make sure that we provide something that is appropriate and doesn't affect that experience. We talked about the experience, and that's still key. We don't want to degrade that, but also we need to ensure that we're helping to keep children safe.
We want them to be using the device
Absolutely.
in the way that they want to use it, and all this needs to happen
Absolutely.
in the background, which I take it's a big headache for you, Simon.
It is, and it's also about education, isn't
Yeah.
it? It's about educating users and students to use devices responsibly, and also for parents to take some responsibility when the device is off-site as well. And we've used Jamf Parent, so Jamf have a parent app that will allow parents to manage, is probably a better word, the device when it's at home.
How do you manage who's using that device for different ways there, or is it, what do you do about that?
Nothing really. It's we don't use different logons on the device, and that technology is available if you want to set the iPad up as a shared device, but we don't do that. The iPad at home is filtered exactly the same for parents and students. We block by category, so they can't, parents won't be able to get onto a gambling site, for example. If they wanted to, they wouldn't be able to do that.
And I also think, technology is only one part of the defence system, if you like, and it's about understanding and knowing that student. Do they have older siblings at home? Is there challenges with home life that just because technology reports back something, it might not actually be that student, to your point, Ricky, that was maybe trying to access that content. It could be a parent, it could be a guardian, it could be an older sibling as well. So it's about giving information that helps with keeping that child safe, but it's not the only line of defence, is the point I was trying to make. It's about education, like Simon says, about educating children how to navigate the internet safely and make good choices, but also it's about understanding that child and the pastoral care around that child, as well as the technology helping with that.
Absolutely, and I agree with you. I mean, at the end of the day, the technology can do so much, but the user is still going to do certain things on these devices, full stop. So, and as you said, it's about educating not only the child but the parents, and making everybody aware that this is the situation that's happening with these devices. Because again, they are consumer devices.
We do have technical controls though. They can't remove the filtering app, for example. So that, the Jamf and most MDM solutions these days will have an option that an app cannot be removed. So we've set our filtering app in that way, so it can't be removed. Students can't circumvent it, which they all like to do, but they can't.
But I'm sure if somebody could circumvent it and they could tell you, then that's something you could learn from.
Oh, absolutely.
Do you know what I mean? And I think that's a good point that you've made there, is when you've put something on these devices that you want to be on these devices, that's not coming off these devices, because where we've said they could be stolen, but then it's going to come back into this process. It's something that's a little bit of a security for schools, because it's that bit where we talked about, wait a second, there's loads of teachers got 30 devices in this classroom. For IT managers, you've now got hundreds of these devices in your school. What's happening? That must be a security. It must feel better for them.
I think it's ultimately these are devices we put in to help students learn in lessons, right? So anything that disrupts the flow of a lesson is not a good place to be, is it? So we didn't want a student to be able to remove, I don't know, Microsoft Word, for example, to then not be able to complete a task in a lesson, because then the teacher would have to spend some time with that student, right, put the app back on and sign in or whatever. So for us, it was about, on deployment, you have all the apps needed in order to support your education. So that's the Microsoft Productivity Suite, apps like Shobi, amongst others, just to ensure that right from the off they can sit down and learn, basically.
I'm just thinking about this thought process of, when I was at school, I was probably one of those ones that was trying to find out to do something and maybe do something different. So the update of apps and the update of the device and certain things like that, wait a second, there's an update here.
Yeah, and actually Simon and I were talking off camera about this earlier, and as a challenging process about, Simon mentioned, as all organisations are, really focused on cybersecurity and trying to keep things patched and up to date and make sure the software is up to date as possible. And certainly Apple's making that easier for organisations, where you will be able to declare a date where it must be updated, and that can be forced. We can also restrict when stuff can be updated, and IT can set certain versions as well, that we've tested this version and we're happy with that. So that is the version that we will allow the update to. So it means that potentially things won't break. So maybe there's an application you use that's maybe not keeping us up to date with Apple's releases as you would like.
Yeah, so we have what I call a fast track group. So we have a group of teachers in each academy. We have a year group of students in a primary school. So I think all told there's about 200 people in this group, that as soon as Apple release an update, that group of people get the update first. And once we're happy that it's not going to cause us any problems, then we'll release it to the rest of the organisation.
And that's probably a good hint for anyone thinking about doing this, is have that sort of test group that you can do this with, and it's not always down to the technician that's in a school, because it's going to affect a lot of the teachers that are doing the education, isn't it? So it's the impact that it's going to have in that classroom, isn't it, that we really need to make sure is still there.
Yeah, we always download the update to the device first. So the update will download in the background, courtesy of the caching server. So the caching servers will cache that update and push it out to the rest of the devices. So that saves on our internet bandwidth.
Can you explain that just a little bit more?
So caching is a way of caching content. So if there's an app or an iOS update, the first device that requests that content, the caching server will download a copy of it locally on a server, a Mac Mini within an academy. And then the rest of the devices, when I push the go button for them to download an update, they will speak to the caching server to get the content locally through the LAN, rather than going out to the internet and downloading it all through the public internet. In some of our biggest schools, where we've got maybe 1,200 users, 1,200 devices are all going out to the internet to download a 3 gig update. that's you're gonna max out your available bandwidth. So that all gets dished out locally.
Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation, so thank you very much, Craig. Thank you very much, Simon, for being honest and open about your experiences in education and what you've done technically in the schools. And thank you very much for listening to this episode of Empower Podcast.